What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the season premiere of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. The first episode dropped tonight on HBO, and there'll be 5 more episodes, which might sound like a kind of a thin, slender season of a Game of Thrones spinoff. However, it is based on a 1998 novella called The Hedge Knight, which actually is kind of a thin, slender story. It's part of this collection of stories called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. It's the first of 3. I've read the story twice. I've listened to the audiobook. I've even read the comic book adaptation. And I would say so far, the show is my least favorite version of the 4, but I'm very encouraged. I thought the episode opened strong and ended strong. And in the middle, there were a lot of scenes that the writers of the show seem to be inventing out of thin air, which I feel like it's always a dangerous game to play. If you're not on the level of George R. R. Martin, don't try to add new scenes because we now have so much evidence as to just how horribly wrong things can go when writers try to add to or contribute to or change the works of George R. R. Martin. Case in point would be the latter part of Game of Thrones, where the writers of the show basically ran out of books and therefore ran out of ideas. And the end of season 2 of House of the Dragon, I think, was showing a lot of evidence that Ryan Condal, the current showrunner, is trying to take some of the principal characters in a very different direction than how they were portrayed in Fire and Blood. But we'll save that for season 3 of House of the Dragon. For now, let's stay focused on A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, a show that I've been eagerly looking forward to for a very long time. And I should add that the show is co-created by Ira Parker and George R. R. Martin, with this first episode being written solely by Ira Parker and the episode being directed by Owen Harris. And Owen Harris is also the director on episodes 2 and episodes 3, as you can see over on Wikipedia. But let's go spoiler-free initially and discuss the big picture. What is A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms? The best way I can describe it is, and I want to be very careful about the identities of certain characters in this story, but it's basically a series of adventures featuring a knight and a squire starting in the year 209 AC. And if you're familiar with George R. R. Martin's books, you'll know that his calendar for Westeros basically begins with Aegon the Conqueror unifying all the 7 kingdoms with his 2 sisters, and the calendar goes from there. So the events of House of the Dragon start around the year 129 AC. The events of the Hedge Knight, aka A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, begin around 209 AC, and the events of A Game of Thrones, where we basically get introduced to Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen and Tyrion and all those characters, that's in 298 AC. So we're basically looking at an adventure that takes place about 89 years before the events of season 1 of Game of Thrones. So there's some characters, and once again, I gotta be careful about spoilers. If you continue to read in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, as you get into the 3rd novella, there's one very prominent character where, if you remember your Game of Thrones lore, he has a very, very long life. And he does show up in the Game of Thrones series, but we'll save all that discussion for season 3 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms if HBO ever gets there. But the 2 main characters in all 3 novellas which make up A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms are Dunk and Egg, and Dunk is short for Sir Duncan the Tall because in the books he is 6'11", which is pretty goddamn tall for the world of Westeros. And Egg is an abbreviation for another name, which I won't get into until later videos, or at least later episodes in the season, because it's not a very closely kept secret. But for anybody who's just watching the show fresh and has never read the books and never read any background, it will be quite a revelation once you learn a little bit more about why Egg has his head shaved and how he came to be the squire for Sir Duncan the Tall. But this first season and the first novella, The Hedge Knight, it's a pretty straightforward premise. It's basically a tournament where Sir Duncan the Tall will get his first real opportunity to test his skills against his fellow knights, and he'll get his first real opportunity to start interacting in the politics of the realm, because there are several very prominent princes that show up at this tournament, and then the plot starts to thicken from there. Because as we all know from Game of Thrones as well as House of the Dragon, anytime a few Targaryens show up for any event, whether it's a tournament or a battle or a wedding or whatever the case might be, eventually blood is going to flow. And so far, I think the 2 best ingredients of the show, and by far the most important ingredients of the show, are Peter Claffey and Dexter Sol Ansel as Dunk and Egg. If those roles had been poorly cast, well, then the whole show would fall to pieces. And pretty much any time they were interacting in the show, it felt like the novella, it felt like the audio fiction, it felt like the comic book, it felt very true to the world of George R. R. Martin. The dialogue felt authentic, and it felt like a very faithful adaptation to the source material, which for me is always of the utmost importance. But where this first episode got into trouble was when it attempted to invent a lot of new dialogue to a lot of 2nd tier and 3rd tier characters. But 50% of a good adaptation is enough to keep me on the hook for the time being, because to be perfectly blunt, almost every franchise in film and television that I've loved over the last 10 years has kind of slipped through my fingers and slipped away and turned into something that I completely despise and completely hate. And this is one of the last franchises left where I allow myself to get emotionally invested and get excited for what the future might hold. But it's hard because George R. R. Martin had a sit-down interview with the Hollywood Reporter last week or a couple days ago, and he basically said that Ryan Condal is screwing up season 3 of House of the Dragon so badly that it is no longer the story that he wrote. And I was like, oh my God, like, way to kill all my enthusiasm for what's to come, because I was already getting warning signs that season 2 was starting to fly off the tracks. But like between the works of George R. R. Martin and Denis Villeneuve's adaptations of the Dune books, those are the last 2 Hollywood franchises where I allow myself to be excited about what the future might hold. But every other franchise out there, unless we're talking about like some animated franchises made over in Japan, I've pretty much given up hope that any of the other franchises that I love will ever be good again. So nothing would make me happier than if A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms were to stick the landing and become absolutely incredible. And the teaser for the rest of the season looked very promising. It looks like there's some really annoying scenes that they've invented for the show, which do not come from the novella. In particular, the flashbacks to Dunk's childhood, like looking for his found family and all this crap. I'm like, oh, that sounds like some really crummy TV writing that bears no resemblance to the writing of George R. R. Martin.
You want a family? Go out there. Get a family.
But all the scenes involving Aerion, the monstrous Targaryen, and the big final joust, and I almost felt like they gave too much away. But if you've read the original novella, that teaser for the rest of the season looks pretty goddamn good. So once again, they've got me on the hook for now, and I'll continue to do breakdowns every Sunday for the next 5 Sundays. But here's my advice. For anybody who's curious about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, first, read The Hedge Knight. It's only 118 pages long, and most of those 118 pages consist of very big pictures by Gary Gianni. It's a very quick, easy read. It's a very accessible read, and you don't need to know a bunch of Targaryen history and lore and that sort of thing in order to appreciate it, just as a story of a knight and a squire going to a tournament and having a series of adventures. It's fantastic. So start with the story, but if you are somebody with a long commute or you ride the subway or whatever, then the audio fiction, which is read by, I wrote down Harry Lloyd. The audio fiction read by Harry Lloyd is absolutely fantastic. Harry Lloyd really knows what he's doing. And after you've enjoyed both of those, check out the comic by, I wrote this down as well. Ben Avery did the adaptation, and the pencils are by Mike Miller. I think it's a very good adaptation, and I love reading comics when I get an excuse to do so, but it leaves a lot of detail on the side just because a comic and a short story or a novella are 2 very different formats, but nothing would make me happier than if by the end of season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, aka The Tales of Dunk and Egg, if I were to say this is the best adaptation we've had of George R. R. Martin since the early seasons of Game of Thrones, but we'll just have to wait and see. But with that, my spoiler-free section is over. Let's talk a little bit about what went down during this episode. So as I said earlier in the video, I thought the episode started strong and ended strong, and it basically featured a couple scenes ripped straight from the novella, but it also helps that they're shooting in some of the most beautiful scenery in all of Northern Ireland. I've never been to Northern Ireland, but I've been to Ireland, and it's just, if you ever get a chance to go to the island of Ireland, it's one of the most beautiful places on planet Earth, but goddamn, at least this show looks incredible every step of the way, even if I have some complaints about some of the dialogue and some of the character interactions in the middle part of the episode. But the episode begins with the funeral of Sir Arlen of Pennytree, and I like how this episode, much like the short story and much like every other adaptation, constantly teases maybe Dunk didn't officially get knighted by Arlen before he passed away. He's always kind of hinting at like, oh, I've got a right to this sword, or I've got a right to this or that or the other thing, but we never quite know, did Arlen ever actually dub him a knight? And obviously every knight in this world can create another knight, but it is an official ceremony that you have to go through, and usually it helps if you have witnesses, which leads to a few problems for Dunk early on in this tournament, where he can't get anybody to vouch for either him or Sir Arlen of Pennytree, and basically the question is, will he even be able to enter this tournament as he wishes to? And another ingredient that I liked was how this episode gave us a few scenes where Dunk is talking to himself, basically providing the information that the audience needs to know that would otherwise be provided in kind of a third-person omniscient narrator situation, because the novella is not a first-person story from the point of view of Dunk. But he does have internal thoughts that the reader has access to, and we don't have access to the thoughts of the other character. So it's interesting. It's third person, but it's kind of third person exclusively from his point of view. And there are a lot of other little details where I was pleased to see their inclusion in the episode. Like when Dunk arrives at the inn, there's a drunk prince who basically says, I saw you in my dreams, like stay the hell away from me. I'm not going to tell you who that character is, But if you know anything about certain bloodlines in the world of Game of Thrones, and which bloodlines sometimes have the ability to dream things which may or may not come to be, that at least will give you a little indication as to which character that might end up being. But that's a scene directly from the novella. But the best stuff by far is just watching Egg just be a huge nerd when it comes to knights and heraldry and tournaments. He basically, like, in the modern age, imagine like bumping into a 12-year-old kid where all he could think about is American football day and night. All he watches the NFL and knows every player's name, knows their backstory, knows their stats, etc. and so forth, knows where they played in college and high school. That is Egg. Egg likes to watch knights fight, and he's obsessed. And when Dunk finds him on his horse wearing his armor, basically like playing like a little kid. Once again, that stuff comes straight from the book, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I hope that the season will continue to lean into those ingredients, and their chemistry so far is absolutely fantastic. As far as what I didn't like in this episode, and this is going to sound very strange coming from me because I will never complain about a show or movie including beautiful prostitutes in the story. However, the 3 working girls that are featured prominently in this episode, they're not from the short story, and their dialogue, it rings hollow. And anytime you have writers contributing dialogue to the world of George R.R. Martin and it's placed side by side with scenes that he wrote, it's like you can pick it up in a second. And I guess the reality is authors like George R.R. Martin don't grow on trees, but I feel like when a writer's trying to add scenes, especially scenes that are humorous and kind of crude and vulgar, you're in creative quicksand, and I just feel like I don't know who this writer is who helped create the show, Ira Parker. Apparently, Ira Parker's doing a better job of keeping George R. R. Martin happy as opposed to Ryan Condal. And Ryan Condal and George R. R. Martin aren't even on speaking terms at this point. But Ira Parker, let's just say so far, I'm unimpressed by his ability to replicate kind of the flavor of George R. R. Martin's dialogue, even if he was giving us some nice scenes with some very pretty girls. But I thought the weakest scene by far was in the pavilion of Lionel Baratheon, a.k.a. the Laughing Storm. And yes, he's from the same bloodline as Robert Baratheon and all those characters that we know and love from Game of Thrones. But the show just went nowhere in that scene. And there's a big problem when your scenes are just inert and they're just basically feel like they're killing time. Like, we all love watching people get drunk and dance and that sort of thing, but you must always be pushing the plot forward. And George R. R. Martin's just a master storyteller. And when you read his novellas, they are lean and mean, and they waste no time. And in a 6-episode season, where every episode is between like 30 and 40 minutes, there really is no time to be wasted. That's basically the equivalent of like a 3-hour movie. And I just feel like just use the material from the short story, and everything else can fall by the wayside. So yeah, I was pretty unimpressed by that scene. Although I forgot to mention when I was mentioning the positives of this episode, Sir Stefan Fossaway whooping up on his cousin, that was a pretty cool little scene because otherwise this episode would have had no action really of any kind. And this is a season and a show about a tournament. And obviously in this time period for George R. R. Martin's world, there are no dragons. So they can't rely upon big splashy special effects or big dragon riding sequences. All they have to keep people entertained this season is incredible combat between knights beating the fuck out of each other or jousting or whatever the case might be. So we at least got a small taste. But if the teaser for the rest of the season is any indication, there's going to be a ton of combat coming our way in subsequent episodes. I hope they'll lean into all the tournament combat, the melees, the jousting, all that good stuff. Because so far I would say this first episode, it's going to be a tough episode to tell people if they haven't read the novella and they're not already totally invested in everything that George R. R. Martin's ever written, that this is a show that they absolutely must watch. For me, I really have no choice in the matter because I'm obsessed with the books of George R. R. Martin, and this is going to be one of the last shows that we see based on the actual work of George R. R. Martin. A day's going to come in the not-so-distant future where the fine folks at HBO, who will probably be owned by Netflix at that point, where they'll be in a position where they're going to be making more Game of Thrones shows, but not based on the material written by George R. R. Martin. And that's going to be a brutal, awful, just a disappointing day, to put it mildly. Look at a show like Stranger Things and imagine that approach to the world of George R. R. Martin, and you can begin to imagine just how bad things will be when they run out of George R. R. Martin material to develop. But the good news is they are working on a show right now based on Aegon the Conqueror. And Aegon the Conqueror, the story of him basically takes up like the first 100 and 120 pages of Fire and Blood, and it leads into some other stories that also could just be like, additional seasons if they wanted to go all the way, but it'd be a big, expensive season with a lot of combat, a lot of armies, a lot of dragons, etc. and so forth. It remains to be seen. if they'll invest all the money in order to do it right. For me, I would just prefer if they did like a trilogy of movies telling the story of Aegon the Conqueror. In any case, long story short, George R. R. Martin is not writing any more stories. He came to terms with that a long time ago. I think he's 76 or 77 years old. But here's the brutal reality when it comes to the world of Westeros and the stories of George R. R. Martin. He wrote 5 of his 7 books for A Song of Ice and Fire. Fire and Blood is part 1 of 2, but he never wrote the part 2. And A Night of the Seven Kingdoms is 3 novellas of a projected 5, but he never wrote 4 and he never wrote 5, which means we probably will never learn what happened at Summerhall. And that tragedy is something, perhaps because I'll never know the full details, is something that I'm just completely, totally obsessed by. But I would love it if George R. R. Martin could at least finish either Fire and Blood or Night of the Seven Kingdoms. But there's no way he's ever going to finish The Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring. And I think the big reason he's never going to finish any of these stories, he already sold off the whole concept to Warner Brothers and HBO. And it's like, if he were still motivated by the idea of fleshing out and building out his world, trying to make it bigger and better and cooler so that he could eventually sell it, well, then that'd be one thing. But once you remove the incentive for a writer to continue creating, I totally understand that he wants to spend his remaining years precisely as he wishes to. But it just blows my mind how frequently HBO seems to anger or irritate him when he's the creator of this world. Like something as simple as the family crest for the Targaryens in the world of George R. R. Martin. Dragons have 2 legs and 2 wings, and the crest reflects that. And yet constantly, when all the posters and all the marketing created by HBO, they will show the Targaryen crest with 4 legs and 2 wings. And George R. R. Martin has repeatedly asked them, please make these changes. That's not how it is in the stories. That's not how it is in anything I've ever created related to this world. But HBO can't even do them the basic courtesy of promoting the most prominent family in this setting in the proper way. And so I have a feeling that when George R. R. Martin moves on to writer heaven and when HBO runs out of official George R. R. Martin stories to adapt, well, then this franchise is going to go down and go down hard and go down fast. It's going to make what's happened to Star Wars and Star Trek and Lord of the Rings seem like a birthday present by comparison. So let's just enjoy it while it lasts, because we've got, at a minimum, 2 more seasons of Dunk and Egg to look forward to, where there's actual material to be adapted. And perhaps the Aegon the Conqueror story will be adapted more or less as written by George R. R. Martin. But a day will come where I will sadly just have to let this franchise go and push on to other stories. In any case, I think I've said all I want to say for the time being, but I'll definitely be doing Sunday night breakdowns for the next 5 Sundays. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Am I being overly harsh in my appraisal of this first episode? And am I being overly cynical about the future prospects of this world? I hate to sound like such a Debbie Downer. It's just we've seen too much evidence in the past where things can go horribly wrong when people try to steer the ship away from what is faithful and true to the world of George R. R. Martin. But we'll just have to wait and see what the future holds. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. And remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.